Greetings, viewers. JLB here. Tonight's program will be featuring an animation film of a different sort. See, it's a combination of live action and animation, sort of like the style of Who Framed Roger Rabbit in a way. But this isn't exactly Who Framed Roger Rabbit. This is the story of The Reluctant Dragon. Now, The Reluctant Dragon was actually more of a film that was more of a behind-the-scenes look of how traditional animation was done in the Disney studio back in the 1940s. You see, it actually... well, the main plot of the film is actually a guy trying to sell the rights to a story called The Reluctant Dragon to Walt so he can make a short film out of it. But during this story, there's actually a bit of a history lesson as to how, well, not exactly history lesson, but behind-the-scenes tour of the Disney studios, and shows how animation was done back then. And seeing as that I'm a bit of a Disney historian and animation historian, I find it kind of fascinating that Disney would actually show a kind of movie like this before documentaries were even a thing. So, without further ado, let's discuss the different steps in the traditional animation shown in The Reluctant Dragon. Now, traditional animation, as shown in the film, starts with the life drawing classes. This is where the artists and characters, well, mostly the artists, this is where they sketch their subjects for reference. And, well, they actually used actual people when they were trying to animate humans, and they used actual animals when they have to animate animals. This is the same technique they used for Snow White, Pinocchio, Sleeping Beauty, and a few other films that use this sort of a technique. And then it moves on to the film score and voice recording session, which is where the characters, regardless of what short film or movie you're watching, that's where the actors give their voice to the character to really bring them to life. And then we move on to something called the Foley session, which is more of the sound effects department. This is where, back then, all the sound for every single Disney film and short was created. See, back in those days, they had to make sounds by hand. Like, for example, in a future feature film that we're going to be talking about here on this channel, Dumbo, when you hear a train bell, or you hear a train whistle, I believe, they actually had to make the sound by hand. They didn't have computer technology back in the 1940s. So every sound you hear in a Disney film before computer animated or computer assisted animated films, most likely those sounds were made by hand. And actually, handmade sound effects are actually still used even in modern films, if I'm correct. Good examples would be Chicken Run and Jimmy Neutron Boy Genius, the movie. One such tool that they used to create sound effects back in those days was something called a Sauna Box. Now, the voice of Casey Jr., she actually used a Sauna Box to change her voice to make it sound like the train was speaking through its whistle. It's actually a pretty cool device. The film then moves on to the camera room, which actually showed off a camera that the Disney studio used a bit more in the 30s and 40s. It's called the multiplane camera. You see, it had 4 different panes of glass underneath the camera, which could be moved up, down, left, or right, depending on the distance from the viewer. And, well, let's just say if one of those glass panes broke, they'd have to have to replace the entire thing. And they have to move each pane in different directions and stop at a specific point so the cameraman can take the shot. Then move it again for another exposure, and on until the scene involving the multiplane camera was completed. Now, next came the ink and paint department. This is where the characters and the backgrounds of all the animation cells, called celluloids, got their color. Now, of course, these days, computers are used to color characters, but back then, you had to paint in the celluloids to give the characters their color. In fact, the women in the ink and paint department back in the 1930s, they actually applied real makeup to the celluloids of Snow White to make her seem more naturalistic. It actually worked pretty well, all things considered. Then it moved on to the modeling department, where three-dimensional models, or maquettes, that I mentioned in my review of, well, not exactly a review of, but more of a discussion of the film Pinocchio. I discussed that Pinocchio created the modeling department, and in this film it shows exactly what it does. Some maquettes of characters that will be seen in later films in the 50s, made by Disney, and films that we'll be talking about later here on this channel, were actually seen in this film. For example, Aunt Sarah and Cyan, the Siamese cats, from Lady and the Tramp were shown, as well as Peter Pan's sidekick Tinkerbell and Captain Hook from, you guessed it, Peter Pan. Then it moved on towards the storyboard department, where the story of the entire short or film was pinned up on a corkboard and looked at by the artists, and they changed the scene immediately and move it around the board to make the story flow in the way that they think that and it should. This was actually first used, if I'm correct, in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And then came the bread and butter of any animated movie that you might happen to see, the animation itself. You see, it was actually quite different to animate things back in the day. It takes a few button presses on a keyboard nowadays, but back then they had to shoot one frame at a time, with each frame being a slightly bit more differently than the one before it. That would create the illusion of motion. And it's very different from now, because all it takes is computer technology to actually make the characters move. For the tour around the Disney studios, the film then progresses to the short film that the title of the film alludes to, The Reluctant Dragon. I haven't personally seen it, but it does seem rather very interesting, for lack of a better term. And, well, let's just say that the film isn't exactly something that animation buffs might enjoy, but for some people who actually would like a behind-the-scenes look at how animated films were made back in those days, this film might be up your alley. But unfortunately, this film was released in 1941, right in the middle of the Disney animator strike. You see, some animators from the Disney studio thought that they weren't being treated very fairly, so they decided to... Well, according to the sources that I have right here on my computer, it says that many strikers picketed the premiere of the movie. And, well, let's just say that it wasn't very good for the family atmosphere around the Disney studios. But regardless, The Reluctant Dragon is a pretty good look at a pretty good behind-the-scenes look of how animation was made back in the day. Is it worth your time? If you'd like a behind-the-scenes look at how animation was done back then, absolutely. But if you prefer an animated movie with no live-action cutscenes or live-action segments, you might be better off looking elsewhere. But then again, I think you might be better off with a film like Roger Rabbit if you want live-action meets animation. But anyway, thanks so much again for joining me, everyone. And on our next program, we will be discussing, well, I'm not sure per se. But regardless, I hope you enjoy this video and look forward to my next one. Until then, take care.